The first time Kehinde knew her father was no longer fully hers, it was during the harmattan of her 10th year. The dry air had crept into every corner of Ilasamaja, covering rooftops, hanging on mango trees like ghosts, and settling into their single-room apartment on Olufeso Street. Her father, Baba Kehinde, once the man who used to lift her heart in Taiwo on his shoulder like a village wrestler, now sat quietly in the evenings, staring at the dusty sky with eyes that no longer smiled. The change began slowly. First, it was the long hours at the mechanic shop in motion. Then came the soft scent of perfumes on his clothes, not grease. Afterward, the small wrapped gifts hidden in the back of his drawer. Kehinde noticed them because she was the one who always helped him fold his clothes. She never asked, she just kept watching. Then one night, her father came home with a woman in blue lace, whose gele was tied high like a mountain. Her name was Alarape, and her voice was smooth like pap. Her laughter filled the room the way smoke fills a tight space, uninvited, choking and heavy. Kehinde watched as her father's shoulder relaxed under Alarape's hands, as if she was removing the burdens of the world. And just like that, Kehinde's world shifted. In the beginning, Alarape was sweet like honey on fresh akara. She brought biscuits from the market, rubbed balm on her chest during cold nights, and sang old Yoruba lullabies Kehinde never heard from her late mother, but it was only a matter of time before the honey turned sour. The first sign was the silence. Kehinde noticed that Alarape no longer called her and Taiwo by name. She would hum when she passed, sometimes with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Then came the chores, small at first. Wash the plates, fetch water from a far end of the compound, even though the tap was closer. Sweep the corridor before the sun rose. Kehinde did them all without complaint. Taiwo too. But as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the task grew heavier. Alarape's own daughter, Adefolake, barely lifted a finger. She sat inside their room with polished nails and puffed hair, flipping through old magazines brought from the tailor shop where Alarape now worked. One afternoon, when the sun was high and the street of Lagos strobed with heat, Alarape called Kehinde outside and pointed at a pile of used clothes she'd brought from the tailor shop. She told Kehinde to sauce, wash and iron them all before nightfall. The clothes stank of sweat and perfume, and the hips stood taller than a full-grown goat. Kehinde blinked. She wanted to ask why Adefolake couldn't tell, but she held her tongue. She knew better. As Kehinde scrubbed and rinsed, her fingers turned raw and her back ached. But what hurt more was the laughter coming from inside the house, the sound of Adefolake and Alarape watching Yoruba films and eating puff-puff without her. Taiwo, ever the braver twin, once tried to complain, but he came back one evening with a slab-shaped print across his cheeks and eyes filled with fury he couldn't express. Then came the day everything broke. It was Taiwo's school uniform. Kehinde had washed it the day before and hung it neatly outside the kitchen. That morning, it was gone, disappeared like smoke. Taiwo had to wear an old torn shirt to school and came back with punishment written across his report sheet for looking dirty. Their father was told, but when he asked, Alarape sighed heavily and said she had told the children several times not to play behind the kitchen. She claimed that they misplaced it. Baba Kehinde looked at his children, then looked at his wife. He walked away in silence. That night, Taiwo cried into his pillows. Kehinde watched, her heart burning like firewood. As time went on, Alarape's cruelty blossomed like a flower watered daily. Food became scarce. The meat in soup vanished. Sometimes Kehinde and Taiwo were left with watery stew and 2 spoons of rice, while Adefolake ate well, belching like a queen. Clothes were taken from their old boxes and given to her daughter. Kehinde noticed her Sunday shoes now on Adefolake's feet, even though they pinched and made her walk funny. Then, as if things weren't bitter enough, Baba Kehinde lost his job. The mechanic shop closed down and he became a shadow of himself. He drank more, slept longer, and spoke less. Alarape filled the air with complaints about money and food. She started selling her car by the roadside and returned every night with stories of men who flirted and neighbors who owed her money. Soon, Kehinde and Taiwo stopped going to school. The excuse was that there was no money, but Adefolake continued to attend her private school in Surulere. Kehinde would watch her leave in the mornings, her uniform clean and her shoes shining. Her books now sat in a broken nylon bag, untouched and dusty. One rainy morning, something happened that Kehinde would never forget. Taiwo was coughing, deep rattling coughs that made the room vibrate. He was running a fever and his eyes looked glassy. Kehinde begged Alarape to take them to the hospital. The woman looked at her, showed her a Ferrero slowly, and said the boy was pretending. She gave them paracetamol tablets, old and cracked from the heat. Kehinde cradled Taiwo that night, whispering prayers her mother once said into her ears when the moon was full. By dawn, Taiwo was worse. Kehinde made up her mind. She carried him on her back and walked to the health center 2 streets away. The nurse on duty was kind. She checked him and told Kehinde they had come just in time. Taiwo had a chest infection. He was treated, given medicine and told to rest. When Kehinde returned home, Arape was waiting. Her hands were on her hips and her eyes blazed. She slapped Kehinde across the face, not once but twice. She shouted about disrespect and stealing, and how children should not act without permission. That night, Baba Kehinde said nothing. He just sat on the wooden stool, looking at the kerosene lantern like he held all the answers he had lost. The turning point came on a Sunday afternoon. Adefoleke had failed her exams and was beating pots in frustration. Kehinde, who was mopping the floor, accidentally spilled water near the doorway. Arape screamed. In her rage, she grabbed Kehinde by the hair and pushed her against the wall. Blood spilled from Kehinde's nose and she fainted. When she woke up in the health center again, an old man from the compound was seated beside her. Her name was Mami Eyabo. She held Kehinde's hands and whispered promises of safety. That week, Kehinde and Taiwo were taken away by a distant aunt, one they had never met but who lived in Ikorodu. Arape never came to say goodbye. Baba Kehinde hugged them briefly, his body stiff and his eyes empty. Kehinde and Taiwo arrived at their aunt's house with nothing but a nylon bag and the weight of old memories. Their aunt, Iya Yetunde, was not wealthy. She sold ogi and moi under a faded umbrella near Agric bookstore, but she was kind in a quiet way. She never asked too many questions. She gave them a mat, a shared plate of food, and an assurance that they were safe. But for Kehinde, that was enough. In that small house near Oriokuta, Kehinde discovered how soft silence could be. No sudden scream, no flying slippers, no cold looks, just the sound of chickens, the old neighbor's radio, and the clatter of pots. She started helping her aunts with moi leaves, folding them until her fingers became fast like a market woman in Sabo. Taiwo, stronger now, found work with a man who repaired generators. Every night he returned home smelling of oil and iron, but his eyes gleamed. He said little, but when Kehinde looked at him, she could see the healing. They were starting to grow, slowly like corn planted in dry season but watered by stubborn rain. Years turned. Kehinde became 17. Her hips widened, her braids grew longer, and her eyes learned to scan a room like her late mother used to do. One day, she sat her aunt down and told her she wanted to learn tailoring. Iya Yetunde nodded, her face soft with quiet pride. A week later, Kehinde began her apprenticeship under Madam Alake, the most feared tailor in the area. Alake was not wicked, but she was sharp. Her mouth was fast, and her hands were faster. Kehinde spent the first 3 months sweeping the shop, picking needles off the floor. She cried sometimes, but never in public. She remembered Arape and knew nothing could be worse than that. Then came the day Madam Alake asked her to stitch a pocket. Kehinde's hands trembled, but the stitches were neat. After that, she was allowed to touch clothes. Slowly, she climbed from hems to blouses to full buba and iro. Her name began to travel, first among the other apprentices, then among the customers. By the time she turned 20, Kehinde was doing better than even Alake's second daughter. Taiwo, now tall and muscled, opened his own generator repair store near Majidun. He wore overalls stained with grease and always had a rag on his shoulder. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was with purpose. He started buying their own small bag of rice on Fridays, brought soft drinks during Ramadan, and even fixed the landlord's faulty wiring without asking for a kobo. But scars don't live that easily. Some nights, Kehinde still woke up sweating, her breath stuck in her throat. She would sit at the edge of the mat, listen to the hum of the mosquitoes, waiting for the fear to pass. Other times, she would dream of her father's silence, the slap that rang through their small room, or the blood that dripped from her nose. But in the morning, she would rise, bathe at the backyard tap, and start folding moi leaves with a smile. Then came the letter, a brown envelope, smoked at the corners, arrived at their compound one dry Tuesday afternoon. It was addressed to Kehinde, written in shaky fingers. The sender was Baba Kehinde. She stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside, the words were few. He was sick, he said. His body no longer obeyed him. He was sorry, though he didn't use the word. He asked if she would come and see him before the end. Kehinde folded the letter, her face unreadable. Taiwo said nothing when he saw it, but 2 days later, they both boarded a down for heading back to Ilasamaja. The street was the same, the smell of burnt akara oil, the sound of children running barefoot, the woman who still sold groundnuts in the same rusted basin. But their house had changed. The paint spilled like old yam, and the gates leaned like a drunk man. Inside, they found him. Their father sat on a mattress with torn corners, his face gaunt, his legs wrapped in a thin wrapper. He looked at them as if seeing ghosts. Kehinde knelt beside him, her fingers brushing his thin arm. He didn't cry, neither did she, but there was a stillness between them, like rain that chooses not to fall. Larape was gone. She had left a year ago with another man. Adefoleka had disappeared. Some say she worked as a hostess in a bar in Ojo-Eleba. Others whispered darker things. Kehinde didn't get to know. For 2 weeks, they cared for their father. Taiwo fixed the leaking tap. Kehinde cleaned the room. They cooked porridge jam, boiled herbal tea, and bought medicine from the chemist. On the 15th night, he died in his sleep. There was no ceremony, just a few neighbors, a short prayer, and a red earth that swallowed the coffin like it had been waiting. After the burial, Kehinde and Taiwo returned to Ikorodu. They never spoke of Ilasamaja again. Instead, Kehinde focused on her tailoring. She opened her own shop beside the buka, painting the signboard with her name in large blue letters. Her clothes were neat, her style modern but decent. Brides came to her. Mothers brought their daughters. Girls pointed at her lace wrappers and whispered goals. One dry December afternoon, a young man walked into her shop. He needed a native outfit for his sister's introduction. He spoke gently, and his hands were clean despite being a vulcanizer. Kehinde measured his chest, wrote down his number, and stitched his abada with extra care. 3 years later, she married him. Their wedding was small, held under a borrowed canopy, with 2 rented plastic chairs and a band of drummers who refused to stop playing. Taiwo stood proudly by her side. His abada also swung by Kehinde, his smile wild enough to touch the sky. Iyayetunde cried that day, not from sorrow but from joy. Kehinde moved to her husband's one-room apartment in Ibobo. There, she started over again. She brought her sewing machine, hung her mother's old wrapper by the door, and placed a small wooden stool beside the window. On it, she set a faded picture of her mother, Taiwo, and herself. Time flowed. Kehinde had children, a boy and a girl. She taught them to speak with kindness, to respect their elders, and to never laugh at another's pain. Sometimes, when the harmattan came, Kehinde would sit outside, the smell of dust heavy in the air. I remember, not with anger, not even with sadness, but with the kind of quiet understanding only those who had survived wickedness carry. She knew Lagos would always hold the ghost of that blue lace, that sharp slap, that silence of her father, but she also learned that from dust, new life could rise.